Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Jason Marczak. I'm the director of the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center here at the Atlantic Council, and it's great to see all of you here today on this beautiful February day in Washington. Thank you all for joining us both here in the room today and also those of you who are watching via webcast for this incredibly timely discussion on a subject that is and must be front of mind for all of us, which is the horrible, horrible plight in Venezuela. First, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of our center's founder, Adrienne Arsht. Adrienne's vision and passion for the region have enabled us to carry out the high-impact work that we do, and to be celebrating in 2018 the 5-year anniversary of the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. So please join me in a round of applause for Adrienne. Thank you very much, Adrienne, for everything. It's also fantastic to have, this doesn't happen at every Latin America Center event, but it's fantastic to have Fred Kemp, the president and the CEO, in attendance today. I think Fred's attendance today shows the incredible importance and urgency of what's happening in Venezuela. Yes, for Venezuela, but also for the Americas and for the broader global community. So thank you very much, Fred, for being here today. Our discussion today is on the top issue for Latin America, and we have what I think is really an all-star group of speakers to provide insight on that topic. I'd like to thank Ambassador Camilo Reyes, Colombia's ambassador to the United States, for being here today. Former President of Bolivia, Jorge Quiroga, for being here today. Great to have you. As well as Eugenio Martinez, Luis Lander, who both made the difficult journey from Venezuela to be here. And a thank you to our other panelists as well, Jennifer McCoy, Gerardo De Icaza, and the panel moderator, Tracy Wilkinson from the Los Angeles Times, who was just with Secretary Tillerson in his 6-day tour of Latin America. Throughout today's event, feel free to get out your phone, but just to join the conversation on Twitter. And when you're doing that, please use the hashtag #ACVenezuela. Now, 5 years ago, the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center was founded with the mission of highlighting the positive transformations in Latin America and the immense progress it has achieved and is bound to realize moving forward. Unfortunately, there is no positive spin on the issues we are here to discuss today. Venezuela today faces the worst crisis in its history, and I would say probably the worst crisis that the hemisphere has seen. It seems like we say this every year, but the situation reaches new, unimaginable depths every day, every month, and every year. There are no checks and balances in place anymore. Food and medicines are scarce, and the deterioration of democracy has been all but completed with the continuous undemocratic actions of the Constituent Assembly and President Maduro himself. This is not just the opinion of myself or of the Atlantic Council, but of the major countries across the Americas and a majority of Venezuelans as well. Here at the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center, one of our core drivers is to show the region's broader importance for the international community. We seek to do this around transformations. But again, in Venezuela, the regional and global implications of the crisis are only now beginning to be more fully grasped. I'm an optimist in life, but unfortunately, looking ahead, the situation in Venezuela will continue to be more problematic as time passes on. There is no immediate end, but that doesn't stop us from working toward trying to achieve that. Today, the hopes and aspirations of the country that many of us once knew are a shadow of the past. We cannot let that be the future. Given the gravity of the situation, we have stepped up our analysis and events, all of which seek to encourage a peaceful solution and engage stakeholders who can influence resolution of the worsening crisis. We believe it is fundamental to engage a broader section of the international community to help improve the lives of the Venezuelan people and contribute to advancing the democratic process in Venezuela. I'd like to thank the State Department, which in part supports our Venezuela work and whose funding has helped to make today's event possible. There has not been a more daunting electoral landscape as the one Venezuela is currently facing. Riding the wave of sham, gubernatorial, and then mayoral elections in the fall, Maduro is expediting presidential elections under a timeline that is impossible for a fair vote, without the most basic electoral guarantees and without allowing full opposition participation. As a result, thus far, two of the major parties of the opposition have already said they will not participate in April's election, and the opposition coalition has said it will make an announcement today on what it will do as the broader mood. Countries across the Americas are stepping up of their denunciations of what is happening. But again, everybody, not just the Venezuelan diaspora or Venezuela watchers, should take note. The implications of what is happening right now are resulting in not only domestic suffering, but international reverberations. There is no doubt that right now the elections that will take place on April 22nd will be neither free nor fair. Today we will take stock of just how challenging the electoral playing field has become. We'll analyze the diplomatic landscape and think through what the role of the international community is, both ahead of the upcoming presidential election and afterwards. As well, here at the Atlantic Council, we are fervent believers that although we are a Washington-based institution, our work must always be informed by the people themselves, not just insiders. Which is why today we are also releasing the results of a new Atlantic Council poll that sought to gauge Venezuelans' perceptions on the country's current economic, political, and social conditions. I'm going to take just a minute or two here to go over some of the results now, which as of a few minutes ago, as of 9 a.m., you can find the full results on the Atlantic Council website. The nationwide telephone poll included 800 respondents from all political affiliations, a margin of error of plus or minus 3.4% at the 95% confidence interval. And polls are a snapshot in time, and ours was conducted from January 7th to January 29th. And as you can imagine, the results show deep pessimism, a concerning outlook on humanitarian conditions, and little to no trust in local and international institutions. First, results showed independents as an increasingly powerful electoral group. Respondents were about equally identified as either being opposition, independent, or pro-government, about a third. What are the principal problems? Food shortages, high cost of living, economic crisis. And here about 4 in 10 say the government more broadly or Nicolas Maduro himself is to blame for the food shortages, and about half say the same for the other two top problems identified. 6 in 10 Venezuelans say Venezuela needs international assistance to improve its economic situation, and that actually includes 35% of those who identify with the government. Not only are Venezuelans living under terrible conditions, they also have minimal trust in institutions. Other than the Catholic Church, more than 6 in 10 respondents indicated they have little to no trust in the National Assembly, the police, the military, the National Constituent Assembly, and also little trust in the international community. And polling, what's really telling are the extremes. And they will show the extent to which positions are hardened. And I thought one interesting extreme was the fact that domestically, 47% have no trust, zero trust in the military. This important poll reinforces the importance of decisive, concerted action against the abuses of President Maduro. One tool to push for change is sanctions. 47% support U.S. sanctions and 44% do not agree with sanctions. But as you can imagine, opposition-identified respondents largely agree with sanctions, and those aligned with the government do not. But interestingly, independents are split, but with a slight break in favor of sanctions. As a follow-up, a much higher number, 60%, believe U.S. sanctions have not affected them personally, and that is despite the government's propaganda machine. I will wrap up with a look at the upcoming presidential election. Here, our poll released this morning shows a problematic outlook. 70% of respondents expressed they would vote in the upcoming election under current electoral conditions. And here again, the ideological breakdown is telling. About 6 in 10 of opposition voters and about 60% of independents said they would vote, compared to 94% of Chavistas. This is partly a testament to Maduro's constant undermining of the democratic process, but also I think it's important to point out that this poll was conducted in late January. And at that point, talks were still ongoing in the Dominican Republic, and this is before Maduro announced the snap presidential election. So this is precisely why we have gathered such a distinguished group of leaders and experts today. There has not been a more daunting electoral landscape as the one Venezuela is facing. And there is no doubt that right now, the elections that will take place on April 22nd will be neither free nor fair. And I hope that today's conversation can help all of us here today provide new insight into the urgent crisis being faced in Venezuela. With that, I'm delighted to welcome to the conversation Ambassador Camilo Reyes, who represents a country that is no stranger to the plight of its neighbor and that will undoubtedly play a critical role in helping push for change in Venezuela. Ambassador Reyes was appointed as Colombia's ambassador to the United States by President Juan Manuel Santos in May 2017. A career diplomat and specialist in international negotiations, he served as Vice Minister of Foreign Relations, among his many other positions he held prior to becoming ambassador. The ambassador will join me in a 20-minute conversation, and then afterwards, former President of Bolivia, Jorge Quiroga, will give remarks, and then Tracy Wilkinson will captain our panel conversation. So with that, please join me in welcome to the stage Ambassador Camilo Reyes. Sí, nos sentamos. Ambassador, welcome. Before we dive into our conversation, I'd like to give you a few minutes to lay out how you see the Venezuela crisis unfolding from the unique perspective of your country. Colombia is obviously a leader in drawing increased international attention to Venezuela and in seeking consensus among the hemisphere's major economies, and is also, of course, feeling the reverberations firsthand of the crisis in Venezuela. So before we get into a more in-depth conversation, I'd like to just give you a few minutes, given how critical it is for you to offer some initial thoughts.
All right. First of all, thank you very much, Jason and Adrienne. Thank you very much for the Atlantic Council for this opportunity. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I think it's enormously important to address this very, very difficult situation that my country is facing and that the region is facing. First of all, I want to say that I have a big concern, and the big concern is it is a big concern which is shared in Colombia by the Colombian government and by the Colombian society. And I think that, unfortunately, the region, nor the international community, has still recognized the size of the problem we are facing and the very dire consequences which we are already looking at. The very difficult situation in which the region, the sub-region, the continent, and eventually, and probably already in some dimension, the global order can enter with the implosion of Venezuela. So the first message is that I think that we are short of time. I think that the international community has to react immediately and has to be able to put together its efforts to face a very, very difficult, very daunting situation. Let me just remind, and I know you all know these things, but I asked my colleagues at the Colombian embassy to put some of the main statistics of what Venezuela is, just to have that in mind. Venezuela has 31 million inhabitants. 31 million inhabitants. It's a huge country with almost 1 million square kilometers of land territory. It has many middle-sized and big cities which are deeply affected by the actual crisis. But one has to have an historical perspective of what is happening. Venezuela, between the 1960s and 70s, had the highest wages in Latin America. In 1980, Venezuela had the highest GDP per capita in Latin America. And between the 1950s and 80s, Venezuela's economy experienced a steady growth that attracted many immigrants, among them some Colombian immigrants, to the Venezuelan territory. So when you look at the numbers today and what is happening today, now you can realize that this is a building that was simply destroyed. It's falling on us. And the result on the region, I have to mention first the sub-region. It is not only the fact of what is happening with immigration in Colombia, but the effect on the region and on the continent is already being enormous. Look, child malnutrition in Venezuela stands at 11.4%, equivalent to a state of complete crisis according to international standards. Primary school dropout rate increased 45%, and the cost of the basic food basket has increased 343% in the last year. Regarding health, 85% of persons who require medicines can no longer afford them or find them. And diseases like malaria, which until 2014 were thought to be eradicated, have appeared again, and it rose by 76%. Hyperinflation, in 2015, inflation reached 189%. Inflation rate in Venezuela averaged 32.42% in 1973 until 2017, reaching an all-time high of 800% in December 2016. So, I know you've read these kind of numbers in daily newspapers. I know that you have read these in magazines and it is mentioned very frequently. But I think that the international community, public opinion, the media, has not realized the dimension of what is happening in Venezuela and the enormous effect that it can have in our continent.
Yeah, Ambassador, you were mentioning the regional implications, the global implications of the crisis.
Yeah.
I'd like to drill down on that for a second before talking more specifically about Venezuela. And your country, Colombia, has felt firsthand the implication of that. A Wall Street Journal story last week on Cucuta, and the tremendous increase in Venezuelan refugees that are literally pouring across the border into Colombia. And this is happening in Brazil as well, which is being inundated by refugees. And Brazil recently had to double the number of military at the border. What are your thoughts on the broader, let's drill down a little bit on the broader implications of the crisis in Venezuela for the region and for Colombia specifically, both in terms of refugees and also in terms of broader economic stability?
Yes, well, first of all, it is extremely difficult to have a precise number regarding refugees because a large part of immigration takes place illegally.
Right.
But what the numbers we are still mentioning is that we already have about 600,000 Venezuelans who entered our territory during the last 10 months. That has affected enormously the frontier region, especially in the most populated area, which is the frontier with the two well-known Colombian departments, the Departamento de Santander y Departamento del Norte de Santander. And among them, Cúcuta and I would say Bucaramanga. But then there are lots of middle-sized Colombian Caribbean cities which are already deeply affected because of the presence of large numbers of migrants who are looking for staples. They are looking for medicines, they are looking for food, they are looking for clothes, they are looking for jobs, and very important, they are looking for medical services. Yeah. That has extended to the Colombian capital. Bogotá is already affected. We already have had some problems regarding, obviously, the demand for different kinds of services. But I have to say two other things. People who arrive in Colombia do not stay in Colombia. Many of them are looking to enter other countries. They are moving towards Ecuador, for example. And we know because there is a register of bases of Venezuelan immigrants who are moving to Ecuador, and many of them are looking to move northwards.
Yeah. And Peru as well.
Yeah.
Peru,
Yes.
Panama.
Peru, obviously Brazil.
Yeah.
And here I would like to mention, Jason, something which is, I think, is extremely important, and that is the Caribbean. The migration, the Venezuelan migration, having in mind the implosion and the rapid pace in which this is taking place, will start affecting in a very, very aggressive way the Caribbean islands. Mm-hmm. And we all know that these are, relatively speaking, middle-sized and small countries with sensible and vulnerable economies and with sensible and vulnerable institutions. And that will start happening, and that is already happening.
Right. And the broader, I mean, and many of these countries are ones that are still reeling from the effects of hurricanes.
Yes.
And you have a migration crisis in the Caribbean, and that obviously has a direct implication on the United States as well.
Exactly.
Given the gravity of the situation, given the 600,000 refugees, there's a number of just epic proportions that Colombia just has not seen, and this makes it a global migration crisis. But how can the international community better assist Colombia, or what would you be looking more for from the international community assisting Colombia and its neighbors in providing some of that refuge to Venezuelans fleeing their country?
Let me, before I answer that, I think that it is very interesting to see which are the products and services which are highly demanded by the immigrants. So first, they are looking for medicines and, first of all, vaccination. Colombia has already provided vaccines, as I mentioned it before, regarding some very aggressive diseases like malaria to 100,000 Venezuelans. And this is a new, advanced, technologically very efficient vaccine that covers different kinds of diseases. Mm-hmm. But we have already provided that for 100,000 Venezuelans who arrived. We have provided medical services for 24,000 Venezuelans. And we already have more or less 5,000 Venezuelan children who are receiving education in Colombian schools, especially on the frontier area. But then, what I can tell you is that the first thing is that we have to be able to recognize that the first very demanding effect of the crisis is going to be humanitarian. And that we have to be able of putting together an effort so that we face the humanitarian demands of the actual crisis. Fortunately, because of the nature of our history, all humanitarian institutions and all international institutions are present in Colombia. So if you are going to look for the support of the United Nations, you will find that the whole system is there. You will find that the Organization for Migrations is there. You will find that the Organization for Refugees, the ACNUR, is there. You will find that there is a huge, strong Red Cross movement, which is there, both the international committee and the national capacity. You will find that if the international community reacts now, there is the way of building, taking stock of the experience that the international community has and reacting now before we see that kind of very, very bad effects and side effects of the crisis.
It's such an important message. I mean, as Colombia right now, we've worked closely for quite some time on the Colombia Task Force of the Atlantic Council and the opportunity that exists in Colombia right now after ending the guerrilla war with the FARC and the peace accord implementation and that. There is this critical moment of kind of stability, seeking that stability in Colombia as Colombia is running up to presidential elections as well, and how can we ensure that the international community really takes advantage, as you were saying, of the apparatus that already exists in the country, given Colombia's history, to really move forward quickly on helping Colombia with the humanitarian crisis facing. I want to just take a moment before we run out of time to ask about going to Venezuela and going into the presidential election, which is the focus of our conversation today. Fast forward to April 22nd. Let's assume that the Venezuelan government holds a presidential election. We'll assume that it's not free, that it's not fair. We'll assume that the National Electoral Council would confirm Maduro's alleged re-election. Again, obviously under a very incredibly questionable situation. What the Lima Group, Colombia's been a leader in the Lima Group. The Lima Group has made a number of statements about the upcoming election. What measures might be expected from Colombia and the Lima Group as a response to such a illegitimate election?
Well, first of all, I think that the main elements that have been built by the Lima Group already show a road through which we can advance regarding international cooperation and political capacity for some way of pushing further so that we can really someday reach our objective, and that is to start the rebuilding of the democratic institutions in Venezuela. The main elements of the Lima Group are extremely important. They were difficult to build, but I think that the most important thing now is to be able to attract other countries, and especially the Caribbean countries. We need to invite the Caribbean countries. We need to be able of showing the Caribbean countries that they have to add themselves to this enormous effort that has been done in a way that is advancing positively. You know that recently 2 new countries from the Caribbean were added to the Lima Group.
Yeah, very important.
And it is very important, and as you know, it has a very interesting dimension if we can then reflect that at the OAS. So the first thing is that, yes, let's extend the common ground that has been built at the Lima Group and extend it to the continent and the Caribbean. Second, we have to be able to push forward national and individual sanctions. National sanctions must be reflected in the rejection of all the countries regarding their relationship with Venezuela and not acceptance of any decisions taken by the Maduro regime. Those, we know those are not legitimate, they do not represent Venezuelans, and they do not stand to international standards. But then I think that having in mind the capacity and the enormous effort that we need to put into building further consensus at the national level and international level, individual sanctions are going to be extremely important. Mm-hmm. They are slow, they do not take a immediate effect. It is difficult to see immediate results, but we know that they do have consequences.
And we do know that the Maduro regime listens to them. We know that those sanctions are squeezing the government. Yes. With that, Ambassador, I'd like to thank you for your friendship with the Atlantic Council, for your leadership and for the leadership of Colombia on the crisis in Venezuela. And look forward to working together with you further as we move ahead. With that, please join me all in thanking the Ambassador.
Okay.
Please. I would like to now introduce our President Jorge Quiroga, who has been a champion, as all of you know, of Venezuelan democracy for well over a decade. He joined us actually at a Venezuela discussion that we did at the Concordia Summit in New York around last year's UN General Assembly. President Quiroga served as the President of Bolivia in 2001, 2002. Prior to serving as country's highest office, he had an extensive career in the public sector, working at different times as Vice President, President of Congress, Minister of Finance, Vice Minister of Planning and Public Investment and International Cooperation. Really an incredible array of experiences, and he now works in the private sector and collaborates with a number of international institutions. And I think more importantly, right now, he is just a true champion of finding a solution in Venezuela on behalf, helping to lead internationally on behalf of the Venezuelan people. So President Quiroga, welcome to the Atlantic Council. We very much look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you. Good morning. I'd like to begin by thanking the Atlantic Council for this very kind invitation and all of you for being here. I come from Bolivia, a landlocked country, so anytime I get invited to Atlantic Council, Pacific Council, Caribbean Council, I like to show up. We're in the midst of that. 2018 is a very important year. There will be a soccer World Cup. It'll catch everybody's attention. Some of the powerhouses, Italy, Netherlands, Bolivia, we chose to stay out, so we wish you luck to all the ones of you that will be going there. But I want to put the Venezuela issue in the context of a 2018 that will be very critical and important on the election cycle that we face. Within that, what's the issue, what role will Venezuela play, and then what can we do as international community, taking into account that we have the seminars called Free and Fair Elections with a question. They're not free, they're not fair. They are the coronation of a North Korea and the Caribbean that will be installed in Venezuela. That's what will be happening on April 22nd. So I'll take that in that order. First, the 2018 electoral cycle. I was at an event in Berlin and everybody was talking about the wild men from North Korea and the ICBMs and I said, in 2018, when it comes to Latin America, keep your eye out for CBM, because every 12 years, the election cycle is such that it coincides that we have elections in what would arguably be the true Latin America. More than half our population, 2/3 of our economy are CBM. Colombia, Brazil, Mexico are holding elections in 2018, and they're coming up in May, June, July, and October. But right before that, we have the Caribbean Triangle. Every 12 years, these three countries coincide, but never have we had a situation where you have elections in these three countries. And right before that, and it's not a coincidence, in April 19th and the 22nd, two ruthless authoritarian regimes are going to have, they're not elections, they're going to have in Cuba the transfer of power on the 19th. For the first time, it won't be a Castro, it'll be somebody else, but it'll be the same regime. And lo and behold, on April 22nd, here comes Venezuela right after the Americas Summit. So you have the coincidence of the three largest economies and these two governments that will be having their transfers of power in April. That's where it all fits in. Because imagine if you have these regimes be ensconced and hold on to power in Cuba and Venezuela, it will have a dramatic impact on what happens down the road in the next on the next few elections. With Colombia, you heard the ambassador, it is the hottest border in the world right now, Colombia and Venezuela. And I haven't been to the one Afghanistan, Pakistan. I've been to refugee camps in Jordan. But it is the only border where you have refugees flowing out one side, contraband massively going that way, guerrillas going the other way with guns, with all types of difficulties in that border between Colombia and Venezuela. And Colombia will have elections in March, parliamentarian, and May and June presidential. In Venezuela itself, some comments, and you've heard a lot of the description. Let me tell you that this situation is Churchill in reverse. The famous Churchill phrase was, never have so many owed so much to so few, I'm paraphrasing. Well, in Venezuela, never has so much power, so much money, over so much time been stolen by such a few kleptocratic regime criminals to damage so many people, and the country most richly endowed than any other that you can possibly find in the planet. Venezuela has everything: oil, iron ore, coffee, chocolate, great sportsmen, the most beautiful women. They used to be bad at soccer. They even got to the second place in the soccer 20 and under world tournament. It is a country that has absolutely everything. And in the midst of the largest or the best oil prices probably ever, to destroy that country to the degree that has happened requires truly magic. It's Midas, the Midas touch in reverse. It is taking gold and making it into garbage. What has happened? Let me just, some of the dimensions of this, the economic debacle, the humanitarian catastrophe, the repression, and then the coronation, the destruction of democracy, and what we have coming up on April 22nd. The economic debacle, you will never in the history of mankind find a petropower that is mired in hyperinflation and the largest economic contraction ever. A petropower, not a small country devoid of resources. They have the highest inflation rate in the world, higher than Zimbabwe. Maduro's economy, by the time this year is over, will be half of what it was when he took power, with hyperinflation. The arbitrage is impossible to describe. If you've all read Moises Naim's book, not the famous one, the last one, End of Power, but the one before that, Illicit, that describes all the drug smuggling, contraband, human trafficking, gun trafficking. That is the navigation manual for the government of Venezuela. Every crime that you can commit is being committed by the government, and the arbitrage is beyond description. For the price that you can buy a liter of gasoline in Colombia, you can buy 33,000 in Venezuela. And you wonder, why is there contraband and smuggling? 33,000. You can buy $1. If it's 100 cents, you can buy it for a small fraction of that in the Central Bank of Venezuela, the best hedge fund in the planet, if you're connected to Diosdado Cabello and the criminals that run that regime. You can get the arbitrage on the currency is 1 to 23,000. It is beyond comprehension the opportunities they have. They have confiscated, expropriated. There's nothing else that is produced besides oil, and that production of oil itself is dwindling down rapidly, and more rapidly or faster than the price can rebound. They have mismanaged, wasted, and stolen 18 years of the biggest oil bonanza in the world. They've drawn down their reserves in the central bank. They sold their gold. They got prepaid by Dominican Republic of Jamaica at 50 cents on the dollars. They withdrew their SDRs from the IMF. They have given up as collateral Citgo to the Russians, the oil reserve to the Chinese. You name it, hunger bonds to Goldman Sachs. You name it, they've done it. And now comes the petro. Maduro is inventing the cryptocurrency, a country that couldn't keep its own currency or manage it well. If I was in Venezuela July last year, the last time, I can't go back theoretically now, I'm persona non grata, which they announced. I asked for it in writing because I'd like to have it on my wall one day as a memento. The biggest bill, the biggest paper bill was 100 bolívares fuertes. Talk about monetary oxymoron. Por bolívar, de Libertador. Bolívares fuertes was 100. And now they went to 100,000. Imagine $100 bills, and inflation is such that you start printing $100,000 bills. And then imagine that you do that, and that 100,000 bolívar fuerte bill is now worth less than half a dollar. That is the rate of the destruction that the country's gone on the economic side. Humanitarian catastrophe, you heard some of the figures from the ambassador. Imagine being a mother in Venezuela. You stand in long queues, depending on the day of the week, with your ID card and the last digit on it. You get marked like cattle. Inflation devours your purse. You go into the store, there's nothing to buy. You walk out, the criminals take whatever you were able to get. You get home, you got to cook with wood and a petrol power. People are losing weight. There's diseases of all kinds. Malaria is back. Diphtheria is back. If you die, they bury you in a cardboard casket because they don't have real caskets anymore. And it is the largest refugee crisis in the world right now. Credible studies show that the number of refugees coming out of Colombia, going everywhere, coming out of Venezuela, going to Colombia, Brazil, and everywhere else, is higher than the number of Syrians fleeing that country or Rohingyas fleeing Myanmar. So that is the economic debacle, the humanitarian catastrophe, ruthless repression. If democracy requires free institutions, free press, and opposition, they have been taken care of in Venezuela. Judges that have been locked up, journalists that have been persecuted. If you tweet, you're locked up in La Tumba, 20 meters underground if you're a young person tweeting. Opposition figures, where there is Congressman Freddy Guevara, where there is governors, Capriles, where there's mayors, Ledesma, Muchacho, disbarred political leaders, Leopoldo Lopez. Here's a prime example, David Smolansky. Please stand up, David, so everybody can see him. Let's give him a round of applause. He is write it down. When you're February 21st, 2018, you heard a former president of Bolivia, you can forget my name. But before this, the year 2050, I probably won't be here. I will have bought the one-way ticket. You will read David Smolansky, president of Venezuela, and you can say, oh, you met him at the Atlantic Council. He is the mayor of El Hatillo. His grandfather had to flee Ukraine, persecuted by the communists. His father had to flee Cuba to Venezuela. And now Maduro, he was one of the most successful mayors, went after him all guns blazing. And he is one of the examples of this incredible, talented people that have to flee their countries to seek opportunity somewhere else. This ruthless repression is, let me move on to the democratic cycle, Jason, that you mentioned. We were there with a few of the former presidents on December 2015. The opposition won 2/3 of the Congress. And after that, a slow-motion coup was unleashed in a rolling four-part process. First is castrate the Congress. They had lost the Congress, so then with the judges, the Congress could not legislate, could not appropriate resources. They could not even approve the law of gravity. Everything was taken away from the Congress. Then they canceled the revocatorio, the opportunity to take Maduro out of office. Then they installed the constituyente, and now we're in the final stage where after December 2015, the regime decided they will never again have free and fair elections. They will only have coronations. And last year, between the Asamblea Constituyente in July, regional elections in October, local elections in December, they have put in place all the systems that allow them to steal outright elections. You displace voters, you move voting rolls, you buy the votes, you do the hunger blackmail. If you vote for me, I'll give you food. You disbar the opposition from running. I can guarantee you that my local team can beat Barcelona if I can do in soccer what Maduro does in politics. You make the goal where I got to score the goals from side to side. My own goal that I got to defend is smaller than the ball. I get 4 times as many players. Every time I score a goal, I count it as 4 with the Smartmatic computers. And you get to pick the players on the other team. They can't have Messi, Suarez. No. They got to have some old, fat, chubby players. Well, if those are the rules that you set up, That is not an election. It is an outright coronation. And that is what is about to happen on April 22nd. And if you take into account the economic debacle, the humanitarian catastrophe, and all the things that are happening, you're looking at a scenario of a Cuban Mad Max Fury Road type of situation coming up in Venezuela. I'll close with, given that that is happening, what should be the international community's reaction, and also what can we do inside of Venezuela? International community, so you won't forget it, I have a little acronym, CISO Demo. It is the time to put everything on the table that you can possibly put on the table as international community. SISODEMO. S, sanctions. Jason described them. They're working. Keep them coming. ICC. Referrals to the International Criminal Court. It hurts the regime. There's preliminary exams that have been opened up, and we need a state to take up the cost when Almagro finishes the work at the OAS and take the regime to the ICC. The second S, seizures. Not only sanctions, but seizures. Everybody knows where these crooks have their bank accounts, their assets. They like to buy nice homes in Madrid, in Colombia, in Panama, in Miami, in the U.S. Take them and impound them. The last O, sanctions, ICC, seizure, and the O for the OAS charter. We should not give up on the OAS charter, applying 2/3 of the vote. DEMO, I'll finish with that. D, diplomatic relations. I hear a lot of countries saying that if Maduro pulls this out on April 22nd, we'll break relations the day after. I submit the following. If I was in Colombia in the 80s, and Pablo Escobar and Popeye, we were sitting around and they were to tell me, Jason, on April 22nd, we're going to do you in. This is Pablo Escobar and Popeye. That's a pretty credible threat. I do not think the answer should be, don't worry, Jason, on April 23rd, I'll take him to the police. No, I know they're going to do something. I would take preventive actions on the diplomatic front. E, expulsions. It hurt them when we pulled them out of Mercosur. Why are they still in UNASUR? The OAS charter. Why are people that are known to be linked and relatives of the crooks and the kleptocrats of the regime living the high life in other countries? I, for one, if I was in one of those countries, I would want them out of that country. And the last two, M, the migration. If there is one country that needs a TPS, Americas and Spain, globally, for the Venezuelan refugees, is Venezuela. And it has to be anchored in Colombia and Brazil, where if we ask any one country to take all the Venezuelans, no one can. Not even the U.S. can. But if we say the U.S., Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, Panama, Spain, do an integrated migration, TPS-like on a regional basis, that ought to be looked at. And the O is the oil. There'll be discussion of what to do with the oil. I will tell you, all the oil money gets stolen. I argued a while ago that the oil proceeds should be given to Venezuela like you give them to any country, through the Congress, appropriated and budgeted and disbursed through congressional approval, and not directly to the coffers of the crooks of the regime. I think the time to do all those things is now. It is of the essence. It is urgent. Otherwise, we will have to be sad about the fact that a North Korea was installed in the Caribbean on April 22nd under our watch. And I'll close with when you look at all these things that are happening and you get sad and think it's going to be difficult, you see examples of Willie playing the violin, Smolansky risking his life to go out through the border, and you see all these incredible cases. On July 15th, I saw the mother of Neomar Lander. Neomar Lander was this young kid with a T-shirt, Yo soy libertador, like Michael Jackson, one glove in hand, to return the tear gas, the mask, the helmet. He was shot and killed with a tear gas to the chest. If I describe that to you, nothing happens. But when you hear the mother, Sugeimar, tell you that on July 15, with tears in her eyes, you feel the tear gas coming into your heart. But then she turns around and says the sacrifice was worth it because he sacrificed so this girl, she would turn, Paulita, 13-year-old beautiful girl, can live in a free Venezuela. They will continue that fight, but the international community has to support people like Sugeimar so Paulita can live in a free Venezuela. Thank you.
Okay, are we all here? First of all, hi, I'm Tracy Wilkinson. Thank you, President Quiroga, for your very forceful comments. Very interesting. Thank you very much. And thank you to the Atlantic Council for having us here. I'm Tracy Wilkinson with the Los Angeles Times, covering currently the State Department and foreign policy, but most of my career as a foreign correspondent and much of that in Latin America. So I'm very delighted to be part of this event. I'm very briefly going to introduce the panelists. We don't have a lot of time, and you can read the longer descriptions if you're interested. So we have Gerardo De Icaza, who is, as he put it, runs the election shop at the Organization of American States. He's been with the OAS, I think, since 2014, and is currently also the acting secretary for Strengthening Democracy, which gives him a particularly important perspective. I was curious, one thing in your past that you coordinated the Mexican voters abroad, which has always been a big issue. Can they vote abroad or not? And it's really, I think, an important issue. Luis Lander is president of the Observatory Electoral Venezolano, who has made the trip here from Venezuela to be with us, often quoted in the American press. He's also a professor of economics and social sciences at the Universidad Central de Venezuela, and continues to work and live in Venezuela, which by itself is a formidable task. Eugenio Martinez is a journalist who has worked at El Universal, which I remember used to be one of the great papers of the continent. And El Diario Las Américas and El Pitazo, who is considered one of the foremost experts on elections, the electoral process in Venezuela. And Jennifer McCoy, who is a distinguished professor of political science at Georgia State University. And as someone who grew up in Atlanta, I'm very grateful to Jennifer for having brought Latin America and the study of Latin America to Georgia. I first knew her when she was at the Carter Center, and that was a few years ago. And Jennifer has monitored elections throughout Latin America for years, and so her expertise too is quite valuable. We're lucky in the range of expertise of this panel to be able to, I think, take two approaches. The international community looking in, what the international community can do, and from the domestic perspective, what hurts, what helps, and what is the real situation on the ground. I'm going to start with Gerardo, but all the panelists will jump in as they see fit. Let's talk about elections. Are there any measures that can be taken that would make April 22 at all a free and fair election, or is that sort of a lost cause? And then I'm curious about what international players you think can have the most effective role in any kind of pressure on Venezuela and a return to democratic processes in Venezuela.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Atlantic Council for the invitation, and for Jason for putting all of this together. Very impressive, my dear Fred. And thank you to the panelists. It's great to be here with Jennifer and the others. Well, for starters, I would say that there are four main issues that have been put on the table or questions on the election. The first is obviously the date. So 74 days to organize an election is certainly below regional standards, which is about 8 months. Also, we have the president of the CNE on the record just a couple of years ago saying that it was impossible to organize an election with less than 300 days. So clearly they've done an excellent job now of being able to organize elections much quicker. Second is obviously political prisoners. So if we're picking and choosing who our opponents are, and not even saying, you can participate, but putting you in jail, I think that's, a far cry from a free election. Venezuelans living abroad, you had a whole 48 hours to register to vote. I hope you all did that. 48 hours is clearly not enough to register to vote.
If they even knew about it, too.
Exactly. And clearly not being able to vote from a lot of different places. So a very limited vote when, obviously, the immense amount of Venezuelans living abroad and how it's increased over the years, clearly, and I would suspect that it's not going the government's way. And the full participation of the opposition now, this has been something that has been written in the Lima Declaration, full participation. It doesn't mean one participant. It doesn't mean the participant that I want to run against. No, it's full participation of the opposition. So that's the long answer. The short answer would be no, I don't think so.
Any measures? Yeah.
Yeah.
Jennifer, do you think, you've been monitoring and observing elections throughout Latin America. Is there a particular organization that's best equipped, EU, OAS, United Nations? And how do these organizations kind of walk that fine line of helping but not being accused of being, imperialist outside meddlers, which is often a tactic that some countries will take?
Yeah. Well, let me say.
Oh, yes, by the way.
That's the answer. Yeah. Let me say first that.
No pressure.
that people have been predicting that this government would fall for a long time, since at least 2002. Right. And I had said to many observers, outsiders, and many Venezuelans as well, be careful not to underestimate this government and its capacity to respond to the challenges to it. And now, but I also underestimated this government not in its capacity to survive, but in how far it has been willing to go to bring the country down into misery. So the question that has been raised, and by our first speakers, the ambassador, the former president, about what we can do internationally, and by Gerardo, is an extremely important question. How can we act? And to answer your question, I want to just build on what's been said and say the important thing for me would be a coordinated, multi-level response. It must be coordinated internationally, but as well to encourage coordination and multiple types of responses inside the country. So elections alone don't solve anything, really. They don't guarantee any particular change in policy to resolve the particular economic and social and humanitarian crisis. They don't guarantee a change in political personnel or a maintenance of political personnel. And so incentives are extremely important to consider, as well as the punitive measures of sanctions. And here I would say, looking at the foreign governments and looking at international organizations like the EU, the key thing to add to the existing sanctions is a clear message about what needs to be taken, or what actions or behavior by the Venezuelan officials who are targeted by the sanctions and by the government that would merit suspending those sanctions. And I'm not sure that message has been given clearly, so that would be the first thing. And then thinking about a change that comes from within. Regimes change in a situation like this when there's a split decision within them. But that is going to require some kind of transitional justice types of mechanisms. And militaries, many in Venezuela have been saying, should there be foreign military intervention? And I think the clear answer is no to that. Can we depend on our own military to intervene? Well, militaries that are dependent financially on the government don't intervene. You look at Syria versus Egypt and you see the drastic difference there. And when power holders are financially dependent not only for legal and illegal, licit and illicit resources, but also dependent for protection from criminal prosecution, then it's very difficult to get them to part from that government. A third thing is the legitimacy. So now we see that the Electoral Council wants to invite the UN. So should the UN go to observe elections? Well, if the Electoral Council wants and the government wants the imprimatur of the legitimacy that a UN observer mission or an OAS observer mission or Luis Lander's domestic observer mission, that could be a point of negotiation. Yes, we will come if the conditions are set for a reasonably acceptable election. So that would be a point of negotiations. So I think that those are the kinds of responses we need to be thinking of, and incentives as well as punitive actions, and the role of many organizations, and certainly the humanitarian role and the role of the United Nations is crucial, as the ambassador was saying, in preparing. So it's not only the incentives and the kind of messages given from outside, but the planning for this kind of response to the humanitarian that is absolutely critical from the international side.
Yeah, I do want to talk more about sanctions in a minute, and also the list that President Quiroga gave us of possible actions. But Luis, what do you think about that, about the United Nations stepping in? Does that give legitimacy to something that can't be legitimate? And tell us a little bit about kind of how the whole electoral process has evolved over these years that you've been watching.
Voy a hablar en español y pido disculpas a la audiencia.
I will speak Spanish, and I ask you to forgive me. Two things. If we look at the experience of Venezuela of having these international observers, and Jennifer was part of some, this requires time to do it correctly. And you need time for a democratic process in general, and specifically for these observers, it's fundamental. It's essential. In general, international organizations that do these type of things never do it unless they are invited several months in advance. Right now, it could be that the OAS and it could be that the United Nations may be interested in sending a mission for the elections, but it is impossible to do it well or quality-wise with the little time that they have been given, if it's decided they will. In Venezuela, something that was very good, in 2006 there was a monitoring mission sent by the European Union, and they were invited almost a year ahead of time. They sent a gentleman for several months before the elections, and the day of the election they took a great number of observers for the election itself, and they did a very good job. For these elections of April 22nd, even if there was goodwill and all the resources in the world, it would not be done adequately because of lack of time. Now, regarding the national things, and something that's never ever clear to me, the Electoral Council, their own Electoral Council, accredited 3 organizations. So this was a bit surprising, but then we thought one was pro-government, pro-opposition, and one that I made part of, that was a sort of independent group. And we liked that profile, too. We liked it that they put us there. But then that became 5 organizations instead of 3, with more or less the same characteristic. But now it's changed. In the elections of last year, it was only 2, the national one, and then we requested, and they denied it to us. We were not allowed to be observers. And they said, there's no time. So the Electoral Council, the National Electoral Council, decides very quickly on these things, and then they use that argument to impede other observers. Clearly, I would say that 2015 was the point in which this electoral process broke down. Nowhere in the world are elections perfect. They're having a great debate in the U.S. about Russia's involvement in the elections.
So we need to always be observing and criticizing elections. But I would say until 2015, elections in Venezuela were fairly appropriate, and the results were fair. Usually they were convened 6 months prior. There would be quality international observation. There's an automatic kind of electoral system or voting system, and when it works well. I've had many debates and discussions about this, but this is an electoral system that, despite the pressures and different moves to try to alter the outcome, once the voters went to the polling place, well, that vote was counted fairly. And that occurred until the 2015 congressional elections. Yes, when the opposition won. Now, last year, and this is the first time that's happened in the governor's elections, the same voting system showed that there had been an alteration of the results, that there had been electoral fraud. For example, in the state of Bolivar, this was shown clearly. And so we don't respect the time frames to convene elections. And as mentioned, we see that the parties that are and candidates that are able to participate are defined by the government. Last year, in the National Electoral Council, there were more than 60 parties that were registered. Now we have less than 20. So we've had brutal restriction and limitation placed on opposition parties. And so, for example, Leopoldo Lopez, Capriles, and others have been banned from actually running for office. And we also had Rafa Ramirez, Miguel Rodriguez Torres. They were also banned from participating. And so we see, for example, that the government is actually picking and choosing the opposition politicians that can participate.
What's your opinion about all of this? And looking at the April 22, is it a good thing for the opposition to boycott, or should they really try to participate? And what's the role of the military in all of this?
I'm also going to speak in Spanish, if you don't mind. In 2010, we had the last categorization of the Venezuelan regime. At that time, we said it was competitive authoritarianism. And then now we're less and less competitive and more authoritarian. And so 2015, in the elections, marked really the turning point. And as of 2015, we understood, or the government understood, that it was not going to be able to win elections if it didn't manipulate and alter the outcomes of elections. So the Venezuelan process really flipped over in the 2015 or with the 2015 elections. And so we have more authoritarianism, and also we see greater social control to manipulate elections. In the last study that was published by the Catholic University, we see 4.4 million voters openly recognize that the only way they have to eat at this time or in the month of December is to go to get food from the government. And so this really conditions people when they go to vote, especially when the government doesn't let voting be secret. And so when people don't believe that their vote is cast in secret and that their food depends on this, and then we have 27% of Venezuelans who say that that food given to them by the government is very important to be able to survive. So we're talking about a universe of 5 million votes, which through social control and the lack of a secret vote, that the government are going to receive. Now, with regard to the elections on the 22nd of April, I don't think we should just talk about that date, because it's not that elections are going to be competitive at other dates. So if we had elections in December or July or June at a later date, that doesn't mean that the conditions would be any better, politically speaking, or in any other way. The opposition, is debating whether to participate in the elections on the 22nd. Seems most opposition groups have said they do not want to, but we see that we have elections for president coming up and also a renewal of many other political positions. The issue of mixing presidential and parliamentary elections means that the electoral conditions are very favorable for the Chavismos or the Chavistas, because they are actually gerrymandering, of course, the system. Now, as of 2015, the Venezuelan government really started integrating the military forces more and more, not only making them ministers, but many of them are in control of state businesses, and that includes mining businesses. So the armed forces have a great deal to say, and the greatest fraud that we've seen in Venezuelan elections in the state of Bolivar, well, I'd like to explain that in the state of Bolivar, the election machines, what they did was put out, of course, they send the results electronically, but the armed forces did not allow this. So they took actually this results to a center, and they were actually physically manipulated. They were altered. And why is the state of Bolivar so important? Because it is a mining center. And so this helped, of course, the government win. Now, of course, it's true that the elections have been convened very quickly on the 22nd of April, but it doesn't matter if it were at another date that's later, June, July, December. It doesn't mean that they would be any fairer. And so, of course, the situation is very complex.
Negotiation, you think? Is there an openness on the Maduro side?
El asunto, o como yo lo veo, primero, República Dominicana.
Well, for example, the negotiations in the Dominican Republic, the public opinion actually thought that, yes, the opposition should negotiate. And so what supposedly was going to happen was that the government went to guarantee their governance. Now, if as of 2015 we have a political break and the governor Maduro understands that it's going to do anything to maintain itself in power, at this time, it's difficult to imagine that there are going to be electoral conditions that would allow the opposition to win. unless the cost of continuing in power gets higher or it becomes more difficult for them. Why would the Chavistas hand over power at this time? Why would they leave power? In 2006, President Maduro actually was able to avoid a presidential referendum that would have taken him out of office. Of course, this meant that the international community was no longer going to actually support him. And of course, this meant that he was no longer going to allow for free and fair elections.
Dependent on the government, intertwined, it's not likely to act any differently. Let's talk about sanctions, and for all of you, sanctions seems to be the tool in this the U.S. administration's arsenal that they favor. Sanctions, sanctions, sanctions. At the State Department, they'll tell you very proudly that they have sanctioned more than 50 individual Venezuelans or Venezuelan firms, and that they think these sanctions are really starting to tighten the screws on Maduro and his cohorts. I was just with Secretary Tillerson through Latin America, and in every capital he talked about Venezuela, and he tried to kind of gain support from 4 presidents and 1 prime minister for sanctions against oil. And he met some resistance there. Even Ambassador Reyes has talked about how this is something you have to be very careful about, because sanctioning the oil could hurt the Venezuelans, it will hurt U.S. refineries, it will even perhaps have an impact on gasoline prices in the United States. So it's a very delicate subject. One thing that the United States seems to be doing now is preparing to promise to give oil and fuel and petrol to the Caribbean nations as a way to get them on board, because they've really been the most resistant to a lot of this. What do you guys think? Is this something that ought to be done? And as we look at sanctions, what about the other things that President Quiroga mentioned? Chopping off diplomatic relations, the ICC, all of these measures. Luis, where do you see some of this falling?
Well, international sanctions against any country are always complicated, and they've always lead to great debate. With regard to sanctions against Venezuela, it makes me think of the debate of sanctions against South African individuals when there were efforts to try to defeat apartheid. And of course, there were different positions that people took, because clearly international sanctions also have an effect on the population that supposedly you want to help. So I think you need to be extremely cautious distinguishing the sanctions against individuals who are public servants or who are officials that are responsible for crimes like corruption and others. And I think that should be continued, those sanctions. President Quiroga mentioned that there are these people that are corruptly living from this situation, but something very different are these sanctions against the country as a whole. And these sanctions against oil are not against any particular official. They affect everyone. I live in Venezuela, and the economic situation in Venezuela is miserable, and those sanctions will actually make our misery worse.
Yeah, I would just add that rather than expanding to something that could lead to such a precarity as Luis was talking about with the oil sanctions, better to coordinate and expand the existing sanctions from additional countries, the individual targeted countries from additional countries to make those more effective. I would think that would be a better route to go. And as far as isolation versus engagement, isolation, this is the question for what exactly it means when countries say they won't respect these elections. and won't recognize them. And if that means, that could mean cutting off all commercial relations, which would essentially be sanctions or an embargo. Or does that mean withdrawing ambassadors and closing embassies? But isolation is very risky as well. And with isolation, you don't have engagement with the government either to talk about policy changes or coordination on humanitarian crises, et cetera. So that concerns me. As President Quiroga was talking about, in North Korea, in the Caribbean, we don't want that either, a completely isolated government that others can't help to solve problems. So I'm a little nervous about that as well.
One thing Secretary Tillerson said was that, well, maybe we have to make things so bad, so much worse, that then it all, which is sort of like, killing the patient to save the leg or something. I don't know what the expression would be, but just push it so hard, make it so bad that things would change. That's a very risky proposition as well. And even in this hemisphere, the U.S. tried to isolate Cuba for 50 years, and exactly what happened with that. Gerardo, your boss has called for embargo on oil. What do you think about that?
The boss is always right.
Right. I didn't mean. What do you think the implications?
That's the easiest question you could have put on the the table.
The implications.
No, I think I agree with President Quiroga, and I obviously agree with the Secretary General that full diplomatic pressure is needed. What I would add to that is that the fact that this is a very busy election year in the whole region should be on the table. Citizens need to pressure their governments. This has to be an electoral issue in Colombia, in Mexico, in Brazil. If a country is not defending democracy abroad, it's not protecting its own democracy. And the way that we can pressure governments to change their position in the OAS, in different hemispheric and international organizations, is saying, your position is unacceptable, and we will hold you accountable in the polls, in our polls, for that position. Defend democracy, defend human rights.
Yeah, and interestingly, Mexico has really sort of taken a lead in some of that as well, although they have manipulated it in a way that they now compare López Obrador to Maduro, which is another issue. But anyway, Eugenio, you've talked a little bit about how the whole sanction issue can be manipulated by Maduro and the regime. Talk to us about that.
I think it's important to look at the Venezuelan public opinion studies done last year in Venezuela. All polls, or most, agree that Venezuelans agree with individual sanctions on government officials. But in general, they were against countrywide sanctions. And before the panel began, in Venezuela, there was a study on living conditions. The Central University, the Catholic University, and the Simon Bolivar University did a study. And this has to do with numbers. 82% of Venezuelans live in poverty, according to the study of these three universities, and 63% live in extreme poverty of these people that are poor. So a nationwide sanction that would reduce the inflow of dollars clearly is going to make the government's job more difficult, but it's also going to impact common Venezuelans. President Quiroga talked about the crypto money, and this has been the response of Maduro to try to get around the sanctions and to do it through petroleum. Yesterday, the government talked about millions of dollars in transactions, which sounds like propaganda because economists say it was much less. And maybe just $5,000 even. So the a barrel of petroleum is what 1 petro is worth. So we have to see how this crypto money fluctuates. But if the individual sanctions and nationwide sanctions, well, the government's been very good at actually eluding them. And the government has been saying that the reason there's a crisis in Venezuela is because of these sanctions. When I said 4.4 million Venezuelans directly depend on the food the government gives them, and some 8 million also depend at least partially on the subsidized food from the government. And so the only thing we have left that really works in Venezuela is the petroleum industry. So if you sanction that, I don't know. I mean, you know.
The poll of the Atlantic Council released today shows 80% of Venezuelans opposed to an oil embargo. I think we're going to open up for questions now. If there are any questions from the floor, and again, I thank our panelists, our great panelists here, and address your question to whoever you want. In the back there? I think you need to wait for a mic, I believe. There you go. If you could identify yourself and...
Hello?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Jeff Ramsey from the Washington Office on Latin America. I just wanted to ask, so it seems obvious that you know, any transition is going to have to be pacted, right? This government's not just going to sign up to go to jail. And I'm wondering, you know, there's a strain of thought that suggests that the government might be seeking to strengthen its hand by going to elections, and I'm wondering if you see any prospect for more meaningful negotiations after April 22nd.
Did you have any one particular you wanted to?
Anybody who wants it.
Jump in, somebody.
Jennifer.
Yeah, that is a possibility. It was a little hard to hear the question, but I think it was, is there a chance that the government could be going to elections to strengthen its hand and then be willing to go to negotiations after? Did I hear correctly? Yeah. That's always a possibility. Negotiations, people do try to strengthen their hand, obviously, before going. I think that, you know, we have to continue looking at negotiations as a route forward. I don't think we should take that off the table at all and to consider what it would be. So far, you know, the July 30th election, one question I had was, were they doing that strategy? Going to the election for the National Constituent Assembly, but then be willing to talk and not to implement the plan for the National Constituent Assembly to hold all power and carry out its plans. Well, that didn't happen. They did not go to serious negotiations immediately, and the National Constituent Assembly played its role in running the country. So I'm not sure that I'm optimistic about that route. I would say it's a theoretical possibility, but that internationally and nationally, looking for new possibilities for negotiations over policies, over the institutions, over future elections, or over some kind of a transitional government, which would be, in my mind, the best route forward, should continue to be on the table.
Luis, do you see any hope for that there would be elections after, negotiations after the elections?
I think the situation in Venezuela is so uncertain that what I can say is maybe that might happen. Maybe that might happen. Anything could happen. At any rate, I would like to say something about dialogue here. Clearly, dialogue is always taking place in terrible conditions. If democratic institutions worked well, we wouldn't be in these negotiations or dialogues. In other words, these dialogue or debate would take place in the parliament, where it's supposed to. So it's only in crisis situations where we have these negotiations or debates or dialogue in other venue, and so, or other forums. So So the government and the opposition go to speak to each other, but they don't really want to be there. And, well, things are so bad that eventually negotiations happen. So in Venezuela, we are always hoping that the crisis can be resolved in a negotiated way. We don't want to go down the path of Colombia. Colombia finally reached a peace agreement, but after 50 years of civil conflict. I mean, there's a great deal of conflict in Venezuela, but we haven't reached the level of, let's say, civil war. The problem with negotiations is, who are you negotiating with? Well, in the Dominican Republic, many criticized those negotiations because we had Maduro's representatives, but we also didn't have representatives from the military. So we just had one faction of the government represented in negotiations. And then we look at what happened last week. We had some internal fighting going on in the Chavista camp. And so the idea is, who are you really talking to be able to have this transition later?
A couple of questions? Good.
I'm Timothy Towell, 31 years in the Foreign Service, from the Kennedy administration to the Clinton administration, and I now work in the swamp. And I'm a great friend of the President of Bolivia because I was consul in Cochabamba when Che Guevara, poor fellow, died there, and don't ask me how. But wonderful list of lists of things to do, starting with the President's good list that we should be leaning forward and going after the bus driver and all of those crooks and officers that are trafficking in cocaine and money laundering and everything else that we don't like to discuss. Nobody talks about that except our president. What do all of you who have different ideas of how much to do, can't you agree, or can't we agree that we should now do what we did in the Cold War? Do everything. It's like playing the organ at the cathedral. Do everything, the nice, high, fun things with a smile, and the nasty things that went on in the president's Cochabamba. Why don't we get rid of this third-rate bus driver and five-star crooks so this wonderful hemisphere, who's all of a sudden discovering democracy again, can get going and move really into the 21st century?
Well, you know, Tillerson, Secretary Tillerson did muse out loud in public about militaries that do step in and effect peaceful transitions. You know, I don't know if that's a policy we want to return to, but he has mused about it publicly. And anytime a Secretary of State says that in public, you have to wonder what's afoot. And I think it sends chills down the spines of some of us. Over here. Oh, hi. Cindy.
Hi, Cindy Arnson from the Woodrow Wilson Center. There's been a lot of talk and speculation in the media about the possibility that someone like Lorenzo Mendoza of Empresas Polar would run for president or be elected, enthusiasm in soccer games, you know, chanting. What, if any, possibility is there that there would be a total, an outsider candidate not connected traditionally with any of the opposition parties, but a national figure that could galvanize the opposition?
When we look at the different studies of public opinion, we see that 70% of the people want a change in government. So it's difficult to imagine that an opposition candidate couldn't win. We see different studies that have been done, for example, ones in January 2018 or those in December 2017. Those who define themselves as independent or as opposition supporters, they're not willing to vote. Or they're less willing to vote than those that support the government.
So under these conditions, present candidates that would be from the opposition, formal candidates or former opposition, have too much, it's too difficult to change the state of mind of the Venezuelans to go and vote. So it makes Venezuelans, these technical and political conditions continue to exist, and they don't want to vote because they don't think they'll win. But Lorenzo Mendoza as a candidate for April 22nd, it won't happen, but that would imply that he would lose his company, Empresas Polar, because the government would do some type of maneuver that would wrest this away from him. So some of the main opposition leaders, Capriles and others, could perhaps have a powerful candidate for the opposition, and they could perhaps invite Venezuelans to participate, but it's not an easy decision for someone that owns Empresas Polar, for instance, because his company, to a great degree, is the only other source of food, apart from the government, that exists in the country, and if he were to lose that, so...
Something that Ambassador Reyes said, he talked about the urgency of action and of paying attention to this, and I think that's an important note to close on. Again, I thank all of our panelists, and I thank the Atlantic Council and the Adrienne Arsht Latin American Center. Thank you very much.